Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jeremy Goldman, Senior Director of Marketing, Commerce, and Tech Briefings here at Insider Intelligence. It's great to have you with us today for our eMarketer Tech Talk, where we host guests from all areas of media, ad tech, and MarTech. Today, we're talking about how digital audio is consumed and produced, and how marketers can adapt their audio strategy to meet customers' expectations. I'm joined now by my very special guest from Tinuiti, Rachel Alaynick, Senior Manager of Client Strategy and Analytics, and Michael Holmquist, Media Strategy and Investments. Rachel, Michael, welcome. How are you both?
Doing great. Thanks for asking.
Doing well. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
So to our audience, let's keep it conversational today. Just use that chat window you see there on the right at any time to submit questions. And I'll do my best to get to as many as we can at the end. So keep them coming, please. But for now, let's get started. Michael, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Let's go ahead and start off. We're going to talk about what the digital audio landscape is and where we are today, how it's progressed over the past 10, 15 years. And then we'll jump into some specifics about creative, different types and everything like that that Rachel will go into. So we'll spend some time on this slide here. Let's talk about the audio landscape and some of the important sectors. We're going to focus on streaming audio and podcasts, but let's go over a couple of the other ones as well that we've seen in this space. So streaming audio. Typically, it's digital audio streamed over the internet or through your cell providers. And it's generally music, news, and sports. Some of the examples you'll find here will be your iHeartRadio app or website, Spotify's, Pandora's. There's ad-supported, free options where you can listen to your playlists, specific artists, specific songs, talk shows, or digital airings of terrestrial radio programs. Next, you'll see a podcast, which is an on-demand media format typically structured as an episodic series led by one or more hosts. Similar apps you'd utilize as we talked about for streaming audio, Spotify, Pandora, Wondery, and the likes. Some of the sample shows you'll find out there will be our, the biggest ones like Joe Rogan, Call Your Daddy, Crime Junkies, The Daily, Pardon My Take, or Radiolab. And then on the other side, you've got more of the traditional versions of audio, which are terrestrial radio and satellite radio. Terrestrial radio is the AM, FM radio stations and shows that are broadcast via the airwaves to a receiver, such as a car in the home. And then satellite radio, our biggest proponent or biggest company there, provider would be SiriusXM. So it's a subscription-based radio, accessed largely through receivers in cars and some distribution via their app. So two of the big differences here between digital audio, which includes streaming audio and podcasts, and traditional terrestrial radio and satellite, is how you can measure and or track performance. At the bottom, you'll see there's the deterministic measurement with a pixel with the digital audio, similar to what you find in video or display or even social, and then probabilistic measurement for terrestrial radio and satellite, more of your traditional ways of finding how it's performing, brand lift studies, studies of that nature as well, to see how that may be going on. But we'll talk more about streaming audio. So Rachel, if you want to go to the next slide, let's talk about some of the evolving landscape. So thanks to our friends over at eMarketer for this updated slide and all this information. But let's jump into how the listenership is going to continue to grow year over year and what we've seen so far. So in the evolving landscape of digital media consumption in the US, digital audio is set to play a significant role. So by 2024, which is just next year, it's projected that digital audio will constitute a substantial fifth of all time spent with digital media. On average, adults are expected to dedicate about 1 hour and 43 minutes each day just to digital audio content. That could be inclusive, again, of what we're talking about: podcasts, playlists, white noise, whatever it may be, whatever you're listening to. So while this explosive growth in digital audio listenership may be slowing, it's important to note that the overall number of listeners really continues to rise. So in this domain, it's the Spotify and the Pandoras that stand out as leading platforms. They're commanding a substantial 56 and 48 minutes of daily usage, respectively. This is really a noteworthy comparison as it surpasses the average daily time spent by US adult Facebook users, which is just about 30 minutes. So among those various forms of digital audio content, podcasting emerges really a standout growth area. Although an area of explosive growth might be behind us, podcasts are still gaining new listeners at a faster rate than digital audio overall. So in 2023, the podcast audience is expected to grow by 4.6%, which is about 5.7 million people more, while the general US digital audio listener experience, or US digital audio listeners will experience a growth rate of about just 1.4%. So we do anticipate podcast listenership is going to surpass about 150 million people by 2027. And another interesting fact to call out is that just this year, 57.5% of all digital audio users are expected to engage with a podcast at least once per month. So again, 50% of all digital audio users are going to at least engage with podcasts at least once per month, whether it's a show you like, something interesting or new, or something along those lines. So to wrap that up, this really translates to approximately 129.9 million people, a user base roughly equivalent in size to that of Instagram in the US. So in fact, the majority of digital audio listeners are also tuning into podcasts as well. Leading the charge in this world of podcasting are platforms like Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple, which have really established themselves as dominant audio-first platforms in this type of content. So in this significant shift, 2022 marked the first time that digital audio surpassed traditional television in terms of monthly adult users. And we really expect this trend to continue with the gap between digital audio and TV widening further in 2020. This also has to do with the ease of access that audio has as opposed to turning on your television. You can easily open up a phone, download a playlist, download a podcast, and listen there. So to wrap this all up on this slide, looking ahead, digital audio is poised to become an omnipresent media channel as we anticipate up to 75% of all internet users engaging with this form of content. It's clear that digital audio landscape is evolving rapidly, offering both opportunities and challenges for content creators and advertisers alike. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide there, Rachel. And to wrap up this section, sort of the landscape overview, let's talk about how it's progressed, starting in 2013 up until now. So we know that digital audio is having its moment. Audio ad spend is projected to grow by 50% in 2016 with podcast advertising, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all digital audio ad spend. We'll get into a couple of examples of what that might look like in the next couple of slides, but that could be anything from a host-read podcast to a digitally ad-inserted read that your host is placing in their podcast opportunity there. So just wanted to call some of that out. It's really estimated that podcast advertising alone will surpass about $4 billion in 2024. And a lot has happened in the digital audio world in the past 10 years. Since the creation of dynamic ad insertion, or DAI, which Rachel will get into in the next couple of slides as well. So looking at our timeline here, prior to 2013, podcast performance was measured through promo codes, a clouded format that limited accurate measurement. This invention, or the utilization of DAI in podcasting, allowed advertisers to really track podcast ad performance through digital means and led to the accelerated growth of the digital audio landscape. So in the past few years, we've even seen more advancement in the growth of the ecosystem, both in content and measurement. And this is ever apparent with a couple of these examples we'll share you can see on the screen. Nielsen launching podcast ad effectiveness in 2021. Spotify and Pandora partnering with IAS for brand safety in 2022. Spotify then acquiring Podsights and Chartable in 2023, and then subsequently rebranding it for an internal tool called Spotify Ad Analytics. And lastly, within the past 6 months, we've got iHeart, Odyssey, and Cats officially partnering with some of these brand safety measurement platforms like Barometer and Sound to really help better understand their products and how they can measure brand safety better. So to wrap this all up, as the audio advertising space continues to evolve and innovate, The future holds an array of exciting possibilities for content creators, advertisers, and measurement technologies, shaping a dynamic and thriving ecosystem for digital audio. With that, I will hand it over to Rachel to talk through digital effects and creative and some good ideas for your brands going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. So within digital audio, you have three different types of ads: streaming audio ads, podcast run of network ads, also called podcast RONs, and host reads. And streaming audio ads are going to be unskippable, and they play between songs or news segments, like when you're listening to a Spotify playlist or Pandora, TuneIn, iHeart. All of those are going to run ads as you're streaming their content over the internet. And streaming audio has really robust targeting options in place. And so you can set up a campaign to reach people based on demographics, DMA, pretty much anything that you can do on other digital marketing channels. Podcasts have two options, either those RONs or host reads. So when you buy into a podcast RON, that means that the podcast network has aggregated a group of podcasts, sometimes based on genre or audience demo, and your ad runs across all of those podcasts in set ad breaks. So for example, Wondery is a podcast network and they have a male skewing RON, which includes all of their shows with a male skewing audience. And when you buy into that, your ad runs across all of those shows included in the RON. And podcast RONs also have really robust targeting options in place, just like streaming audio. These RON spots are sometimes called producer read or announcer read spots, which really just means that someone other than the host is going to be reading your ad. There are rare cases where you can buy a producer read spot for a specific show instead of for an RON. The Daily is a good example of this, where you can buy into just the Daily instead of a group of shows, but Michael Barbaro is typically not allowed to be the one reading your ad because he has to preserve journalistic integrity. And so in summary for podcast RONs, this is where you have the group of shows with one ad running across all of them. On the other hand, host reads are when you buy into a specific show and the host of that show does the ad read. And so going back to Wondery, Wondery has a show called Business Wars. And if you bought into Business Wars as a host read, then the host of that show is going to read your ad during an episode. But if you bought into that male skewing RON, which includes Business Wars, then someone else is going to read your ad on Business Wars, and that same ad is going to run across other male skewing Wondery shows. And so for host reads, there are limited targeting options available, but we are starting to see some podcast networks unlock geo-targeting capabilities for certain shows. And because podcasts are downloaded instead of streamed, the way we're able to measure performance is through something called dynamic ad insertion, or DAI for short. And so when someone downloads a podcast episode, there are these set ad breaks during it. And the podcast network can dynamically adjust what happens within those ad breaks. So they're able to swap different ads in and out. And each ad has a pixel appended to it. That pixel is collecting information about the listener. So when that same listener visits your brand's website, you're able to match the information from the pixel to your site's analytics to recognize that it's the same person. And because the pixel is attached to the ad itself and not the podcast entirely, it only collects info when someone actually listens to the ad. So DAI is what's used across both podcast RONs and host reads. Host reads also have an alternative to dynamically inserted ads, which are called baked-in ads. So baked-in spots are part of the podcast content rather than the set ad breaks. And so they're part of the episode the same way that product placement can be part of a TV show. So you can't ever remove the ad without removing the episode itself. I'll move into the next slide to talk more about this. So those baked-in spots are going to live in the show forever, and they tend to be the most premium and organic placements because they're not part of an ad break. The listener can't skip through them without missing some of the podcast that they're listening to. But because those ads aren't read in those set ad breaks that the network has control over, you can't attach a pixel to the ad for measurement. Instead, you can append what's called an analytics prefix to the RSS feed, which essentially sends a modified URL to the server when someone listens to an episode. And then you can do that matching with your site's analytics to recognize the info sent from the modified URL. But the primary downside to this is that you have no way of knowing if someone listened to the part of the episode with your ad in it or not. And this kind of measurement is still developing, and it's not available across all baked-in spots or all podcast networks. The most popular way to track baked-in ad performance is with promo codes or brand lift studies. Dynamically inserted host reads are going to run within those set ad breaks, so you have complete control over when they start and stop running, and you're doing that one-to-one pixel measurement that's also used across streaming audio and video too. There is a secret third option called faked in ads, where it's dynamically inserted, but it sounds like it's being read live or during the podcast content. And that isn't always available, but some networks are able to offer it when you want the accuracy of pixel measurement, but the organicness of a baked in spot. And as we've been talking about host reads, you might be wondering who's in charge of producing a host read creative. So all other digital marketing channels are going to require the advertiser to supply the ad, but in audio, you have the option to have the network or vendor produce the spot. And this applies to both streaming audio and podcasts. And podcast networks actually have to produce all host reads, as they're the ones working directly with the podcast talent. And because we've been talking about 3 different types of inventory, I want to clarify how that process works for each type. So we have this handy chart. Within streaming audio, where you have that spot that's running across usually music, it can be produced by either the advertiser or the network. If you want the network to produce the spot, then you just have to send over a script in any other directions, like what tone the voiceover talent should use, what music should be in the background, whether you prefer male or female voiceover talent, etc. And that's really similar to how the process works for podcast RONs. The main difference is that streaming audio almost always has investment minimums for vendor-created assets, and that's a little bit less common for podcast RONs. For host reads, the network is always going to produce this asset, and it's always going to be included as added value when you buy a host-read spot. To get the best possible host read, we recommend that you gift a product sample and send copy points. So then the host can experience your product and speak to it genuinely, and they can still touch on key points, like if you want them to mention that your brand is sustainable. If you're unable to send a product sample, then you can send a script for the host to read. And so now that we've covered what the options are in digital audio, let's talk about getting launched on audio and how to strategically use this channel. There are some considerations to keep in mind about each different inventory type we've talked about. Streaming audio has the lowest CPMs in the audio space. Its lead time is relatively short at only 1 to 3 weeks, and you have a lot of flexibility in creative production and targeting. And that's really similar to podcast RONs, but the RON CPMs tend to be around 10 to 15% higher than streaming audio. And there's also the additional consideration of category exclusivity. So category exclusivity only exists for podcasts, and it refers to when a podcast has an exclusive contract with an advertiser and will not advertise competitors on the same show or the same episode, depending on the terms of the contract. And so for podcast RONs, sometimes they'll allow competitors to advertise on the same show, but not within the same episode. Podcasts also have longer cancellation windows than other digital marketing channels. So if you're optimizing your campaign and cutting spend on a podcast RON line, you're going to need to give the network 2 to 4 weeks to implement that change. For host reads, you're looking at the most premium CPMs in audio. And the lead time is also the longest because host reads sell out very quickly. So we have 2+ months listed on the slide, but we see some shows being booked out a year in advance. So if you know that you want to be on host reads, we definitely recommend starting that conversation as soon as possible. The vendor always creates the spot, targeting is limited, and where possible, we recommend getting category exclusivity. Having category exclusivity makes host endorsements more genuine because they can't say that they love DoorDash and then 10 minutes later say that they actually love Uber Eats. Host reads also have longer cancellation windows, and in some cases, they can't be canceled at all. Lastly, hosts have to agree to work with the advertiser because they're the ones reading the ad and saying that they support this brand. And so there are some cases where a brand or product just doesn't align with the host's image, and they're not comfortable doing a host read on their show. And so this is something that the podcast network would flag, and it's another reason why you want to start sourcing host reads as early as possible. And last but not least, you're probably wondering when to use each type of media. The good news is that depending on the rest of your marketing portfolio, you have a good deal of flexibility to use this channel a few different ways. So we often see streaming audio being used as a proof of concept for audio as a whole. Because it has the lowest CPMs and the fewest barriers to entry, it's really easy to test into. It's often thought of as an upper funnel channel, but we also see it driving full funnel, bottom funnel performance. And the same goes for podcast RONs. And these RONs are also an efficient way to test podcasts without having to invest in those premium host-read CPMs. So a podcast RON spot is likely not going to resonate as strongly with the listener as a host read because the listener doesn't have a connection to the reader and there's no personal endorsement. But if your audience is there on that podcast, you should see some lift. And so you can tap into podcast RONs to get a better sense of what podcasts your audience listens to, and then you can follow up with a host read. So you might run on a podcast RON and see strong performance, and then the network could tell you that a majority of impressions landed on a particular genre like true crime, and you can follow up with a true crime host read. Host reads are often thought of as mid or upper funnel drivers, but when you get a strong audience alignment on a show, we see that drive success at the bottom of the funnel as well. So I know we just went through a lot of information, and Michael and I can ramble about audio for hours, and so I'll pass it back to Jeremy for a moment.
Thank you so much. And I have not had lunch yet, so I'm glad you mentioned DoorDash and Uber Eats. I think I'll order from both of them afterwards. So some extra promo there, but seriously, keep the questions coming. We're getting some good ones from the audience. Rachel, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us so far. We've got quite a few questions from our audience already, so let's get straight to the Q&A. Maybe let's get started here. Could you elaborate on how digital audio fits into a comprehensive marketing strategy and its advantages?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this one, Jeremy. Really to answer your question about how it fits into the overall marketing strategy, it's important to see, what it can do and where it fits in the funnel. So audio as a medium, as we talked about, has massive reach. And going back to the eMarketer reports we were talking about, it's just going to be continually growing as we have more and more users looking at it. So it's got awesome reach, a massive reach, and it's also has an opportunity to drive lower funnel results. So it can fit in different cogs of your marketing funnel, your marketing campaigns, your marketing strategies. Specifics for some other channels, host reads, can really include personal endorsements, bringing an element of influencer marketing that doesn't have to be tied into social campaigns. Host reads are something that you find that you might not be able to find in display or some video inventory, or even in TV in some cases. Really marketing campaigns, they need to include some sight, sound, and motion. And so audio is then covered in that sound portion when you also have other elements with sight and sound too. And then, there are some digital audio elements that are very cost efficient and cheap, and they're more efficient than some other channels in terms of audience development and rates when it comes to like print, linear, and radio for that matter. And then really there's some high profile podcast programs that also drive mass reach as consumers regularly listening to their favorite shows. And one of the things I want to point back to is the point of television viewership going down a little bit and digital audio viewership and listenership going up. With that said, going back to that last point about podcast programs, a lot of people are tuning into their favorite podcast program weekly, bi-daily, monthly, whatever it may be. They're going back to that more than some of what their other programs. And then that probably, hopefully that answers some of those questions there on the marketing strategy and how it's compared to other channels.
And quite a few really good ones here. Not sure where to go next. Maybe, this is a good one. And I think, Rachel, maybe you're best suited for this one. Can you discuss which formats and ad units are typically most responsive for D2C brands? Somebody's asking. And then just to broaden it out, are you seeing any differences, from industry to industry in terms of, which formats work for who?
Formats is in like ad length?
Yeah, it could be, like when we're talking about, read by the host, and just basically running the gamut from all the different things that you discussed, all the different variables.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in an ideal marketing portfolio, you're going to want to have a healthy mix of all formats because streaming audio and podcast RONs are going to be really efficiently priced. That's going to drive efficiency through the funnel. And then we see that host reads where you have that really strong audience alignment and where that host is genuinely excited about your product. That's where we tend to see the most responsiveness. Those spots are just the most expensive. And so we typically recommend that if you're creating an audio strategy, just because a host read can be the most responsive, it shouldn't be the basket that you put all of your eggs in. You're going to want to use podcast RONs to identify what's the right host read for you. And we recommend continuing to run on those RONs even when you're invested in host reads, because you're going to get a more diverse media mix and you're going to have stronger reach.
Makes a lot of sense. We had one question about Apple. Does Apple allow podcasts to track activity across other companies' apps and websites?
I don't believe that Apple allows that. And so if you're using pixel measurement, that's not going to be an issue because if someone's listening within Apple Podcasts, that pixel is still going to fire and you could do the one-to-one matching, but you wouldn't be able to track if someone listened within Apple Podcasts and then like looked something else up online.
Sweet, short, to the point. Totally makes sense. There's another question that I think goes back to something that you were talking about before, Rachel, and whoever wants to jump in, feel free. How would you recommend approaching digital audio for clients who are looking for lead generation? Because you're right, there are different parts of the funnel, and you're trying to. You might have a different objective depending on what type of campaign you're running.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take this one again. This is where if you're going for lead generation, I would want to go in with a really, really diverse media mix. And you want to make sure that you're measuring all of this. So once you get your initial feedback from that first test within the first 2 to 3 weeks of the campaign, you're going to want to optimize. And so typically I'd recommend going in with streaming audio, podcast RONs, and a couple host read spots. I would keep that host read investment to a minimum to start with, unless you already have a lot of data on what types of shows are going to work for you and where your audience really is. And I would recommend going for shows where it feels like the most natural fit. And so if you have an influencer marketing team, bring them in to help choose the host reads because you're really looking for a host that's excited here. If you're going for lead generation, a lot of it depends on, what your product is, where you're advertising, and any other campaign goals. You can really make it work across streaming audio, podcast RONs, and host reads. I always recommend testing all of them and just having that more minimal host read investment to start. So then you have the most reach possible, and then you can optimize from there.
I think that makes sense. Michael, let's get you in here. I know that this is something that would be perfect for you, I think, because we talked a lot about the growth of digital audio in general. Thank you for using one of our lovely charts. But how does the reach and effectiveness of audio compare to TV advertising, especially in the context of cord cutting and streaming? What does your reach look like in one channel versus the other?
Yeah, so as we know, TV was the ultimate source of how we were consuming media. And we're seeing a shift and trend away from streaming, and then obviously, so while we see TV viewership is declining and the digital audio listenership is growing, so there's a really a chance to test into both if that's what you're looking for. Some of that older linear audience can start to be captured by radio, Sirius XM, and Pandora as they shift towards digital audio as well. Even TV shows are being adopted into podcast formats. One example is ESPN 30 for 30s. Part of some content companies' strategies are to create both. Hey, we're going to have a television program that's also going to be a podcast, and we're going to simulcast it on YouTube. So there's different touch points and different ways to view it. So it's not all one size fit all. It's just different ways of viewing and garnering reach. And then I really want to finish off this question saying, we can really think of audio as a complement to TV advertising, but both are really strong reach drivers. Audio, however, can deliver more lower funnel actions when we're talking about D2Cs or lead generations as really compared to television when you're looking at the cost.
That's a really good point. That's something that we've seen even in our data, just the ability to hit people in multiple channels. They all reinforce one another, work very nicely with one another. And actually that kind of brings us to this question. I like this transition about what strategies can advertisers use to address ad fatigue and listener resistance without compromising campaign effectiveness? Because obviously you're trying to strike a balance between having as high of an ROI as possible, but you don't want too many insertions or just people who are used to listening to ads 24/7 hearing yet another ad from your brand. So what do you do there?
I'll take this one. I think step one is going to be that you frequency cap all of your buys. So you're limiting how many times someone can hear your ad within a set period. A typical frequency cap is something like once a day. Next thing you're going to want to do is keep your pulse on share of voice. And so share of voice is of all the ads run on a podcast, how many of them are yours? So you never want to be 100% share of voice because that's going to create fatigue. But typically somewhere between 40 to 60% for a host read it's a healthy range, provided that you have frequency caps. And I know I've already said this, but I recommend having that diverse media mix. So you're not putting your whole budget into one podcast. You're being heard across different types of inventory. So no one's going to listen to a podcast thinking, oh my God, this brand always advertises here. Then the last thing that I would do is I'd recommend that you adjust your creative rotations. And so you can run different creatives throughout your campaign. And podcast networks actually regularly provide ad refreshes. So even if there isn't a change to your script, they'll redo the ad read to help keep it fresh. And so I recommend taking advantage of those frequency caps, keeping an eye on share of voice, having a diverse media mix, and then adjusting your creative rotations to avoid fatigue.
Such good advice. It's almost like you do this for a living. This is another one that I think is a follow-up to the conversation we had with Michael a second ago with respect to cord cutting. Do you see synergistic effects of serving visual ads to people who have heard your audio ad as tracked by pixels?
Yeah, absolutely. We see a lot of synergies between different channels or even including banners on your streaming audio assets. And so we tend to see that when people are touched by both video and audio components, we see that latency is shorter, see that frequency is lower, and responsiveness is higher.
Michael, anything to add there?
Yeah, just going into the overall marketing mix, really everything will complement each other, and that could come through different creative rotations that you may have. You may have an audio spot that says one thing, and then a video spot that says something very similar, and they can also work together. One of the other things I will call out is some of these partners, if you work with podcasts or host reads, they can incorporate the video into their feed of their podcast if they're putting it on YouTube. So it's something that you can also run simultaneously together. Again, to really hone in on what you're trying to achieve or what your creative messaging or what your output you would like.
This is something very important to get to. What tools are typically used to integrate audio ad performance into attribution models? Because I think everybody who's listening today is very interested in the ROI of audio, but then also to integrate it into the attribution models that they have, that they're, funneling all their other campaigns into. Are any advice there?
This is where
go for it, Rachel.
you go for it. I've taken too many.
Yeah. So we do have some internal tools here at Tinuiti that can help with attribution all the way down to the level for our audio campaigns. And then there's also some, outside sources that we listed on one of those slides with progressions that can help with measurement as well. So there's different, sites and dashboards and programs, everything out there that can help with audio. But it's important to, if you don't have that level of measurement capabilities, you can add in the old school approach with promo codes to sort of track measurement as well. Anything else you wanted to touch upon there, Rachel?
Yeah, when possible, if you're trying to figure out what attribution system you want to use, I would really recommend going the DAI route on podcasts, just to make sure that you can have that pixel on the ad. And so you know that you're collecting the data, even if you're figuring out what attribution system you want to use, being able to have that one-to-one matching option available to you is going to be really important.
Sounds good. Let me see. I think we have time for maybe one more, but these are really great questions. What are some innovative ways that companies have leveraged digital audio to enhance their brand campaigns? Can you share any standout case studies or examples?
Yeah, I love this question. And so at Tinuiti, we had a client who gifted a product sample to a podcast host, and that host just loved it. They ended up going completely off script, and they ended up providing a 90-second personal endorsement of the product during the show. And because they did it of their own volition, the audience was really able to recognize it as genuine, and they saw a huge uptick in conversions for this client. We've also seen really strong synergies between audio and other channels. And so one thing some of my clients have done is that they retarget users from other channels on audio to really capitalize on those synergies and drive conversions from those who just needed that extra push after being touched by another channel. And so in general, I would say that audio, especially host reads, have an opportunity to make paid media really personal. And so the more you're able to lean into that and use your data effectively across channels, the stronger your results will be.
To piggyback off of that, really getting into the host read opportunities, some innovative ways that you'll find some brands out there is they'll have their podcast shows or their top programs do in-person events. And that can lead to a podcast that they can record and put on their channels, and or it's just an opportunity for fans to meet their favorite podcasters and for brands to jump in and sponsor, whether it's giveaways or opportunities to try something new on the ground. It opens up a whole new on the ground marketing strategy.
Well, that was some really great stuff. You action-packed, a lot of information in there. Rachel, Michael, thank you again for this great content and answering all of those questions from our audience. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys.
And before, yeah, of course. And before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune into Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast, everywhere you listen to podcasts. And please check out our various newsletters. Keep an eye on your email for the link to today's recording. Thank you all for your time. And thanks again to Rachel, Michael, the team at Tinuiti, and our Studio II crew, our production team behind the scenes for making this webinar possible. We'll see you all on the next Tech Talk.